Now, for us to begin, we have to look at how we are currently doing our sign-in. As we know, signing in is an asynchronous action. We want to switch our sign-in process and authentication process over to a more promise-oriented method of checking our server, fetching against our server, and then updating our reducer accordingly. Now, we want to do this in a promise-oriented way and not this observable way that we've got it, because a lot of applications are probably going to use a promise-oriented way of doing authentication and sign in and sign out. So the best way that we can tackle this is we need to figure out what of those three methods of fetching and then succeeding and then failing we need to do with our existing sign-in flow. So we know that right now in our sign-in form, we either trigger a sign-in with Google or a sign-in with email and password. So these are both different methods that we need to call. So we can evaluate that we probably need to create two separate sign-in success, sign-in start, and sign-in failure action types. So that's what we're going to do first. If we see that there's overlap, we can of course refactor after. But the first thing that we need to do is we are going to make a Google sign-in start our Google sign-in success, and our Google sign-in failure. Then we need the same thing for our email sign-in. And then we'll do the same thing so that we have our success and our failure. So now that we have our action types, we need to create those actual actions. And each one will be a little different. So first we need our Google sign-in start, which is equal to a function that will just trigger the actual sign-in. So here we're going to take user action types.google sign-in start. We don't need a payload because all we're saying is we're telling the eventual saga we will write that will house our actual sign-in with Google trigger that we need to trigger our sign-in. Now, our success and our failure calls will be different. Because our success, we're going to need the actual current user at the end of it. So here, we're going to do Google sign-in success, which is equal to this function that will get a user that we will then set as our user action types dot Google sign-in success. And our payload is our user. We'll then also finally need our Google sign-in failure, which will get our error if anything goes wrong. And we will say Google sign-in failure, where the payload goes to our error. Now, we're going to need the same actions, except we're going to need them to be email. So here we can just set this to email, except our type here needs to be capitalized. Now, the big difference with our email sign-in start is that we know that we have to pass in a password and an email when we look at our method. Because what we do is we pull it off of our state and then we pass it into here. So our email sign-in will actually need to take an email and password value. Now, we can pass it in as an object, or we can pass it in as separate parameters. But the way that I would prefer us to do it is we just pass it in as the email and password. And we're just going to say that when this comes in, we're going to get email and password, like so. And then we'll just say our payload is that object. Success and error will be pretty much the exact same. And this will be our user actions. Now, with this, we of course will need to also modify our reducers. So what we'll do inside of our user reducers is we will anticipate what's going to happen, right? Now that we're switching over to the sign-in success on both our Google and email sign-in. So here, we are going to say that whenever we get our success call, we're just going to say Google sign-in success. We're going to get a payload, which will be equal to the action.payload, and we're going to set our current user to it. The same thing will happen with email sign-in success. So we actually are able to stack these cases like this, which essentially represents that if either of these actions are the case, this will be what gets returned. So we don't have to write two separate case statements with their own exact identical return statement. And now we can actually do the same thing with our user action types.google sign-in failure, as well as our email sign-in failure. And here we'll have to store some error, which will also by default be null. And here what we can say is we can say that error goes to action.payload, and we're also going to spread whatever other state is in here inside of this. Now, another thing that we might want to do is clear the error if our message ever succeeds. So here inside of our success, we're also going to set error back to null if our action type succeeds, right? Where we sign in successfully, then we want to clear any errors. The reason we do this is because say we get an error and then they retry the sign in, well, then we do want to set error to null. We want that value to be null again. Now, after this, the next thing we need to do is we need to actually modify our application code so that it no longer leverages this. So here we're just going to comment this out because in the midst of us changing our application over, we know that the majority of our code that has to do with our user authentication actually lives inside of here. So we don't want this to conflict with the new code that we're going to write, which is perfectly fine. And now we're going to begin writing our sagas. So in order for us to write our sagas, we got to actually add a new user saga. Now, inside of our user sagas, we are going to import in our take latest as well as the put from Redux saga/effects. Now, the first one we should handle is our Google sign-in. So in order for us to write our Google sign-in, we got to think about what we need. We are just going to listen for Google sign-in start, and then we are going to trigger our actual sign-in from the saga. So here we need to write our first function, which is going to be called on Google sign-in start. Now, of course, we need to take that action that we're going to listen for. So we're going to import in our user action. Now, before we do, there is one slight tweak we need to make. We should change our export for user actions over to a default export, because this will be the only thing we're exporting. And as a result, we'll probably have to change our code that is importing in our user actions to also now treat it as a default export. And there'll probably be just our actions folder, our actions file, and then our reducer file. And now we'll just import user action types from user.types. And now inside of our saga, we're going to yield to this take latest listener on our user action type Google sign in start. And then what we're going to trigger is the code related to signing in with Google. So we're going to make a new generator function called sign in with Google. And inside of here is going to be the code that we had before inside of our sign-in component that triggered our Google sign-in. Now, our Google sign-in is a method on our Firebase utils that pretty much just triggers this call here. But we want to call the auth sign-in with popup ourselves because we want the object. We're no longer relying on this listener to tell us whether or not the user has signed in. So we actually need to move this code outside of this function call that we've written. And I'll show you how we'll do this. First, we're going to rename our provider to Google Provider. And we're also going to export this provider out. Export right here. And now what we'll do is we will import in our Google provider and our auth object from our Firebase utils. Now, what we need to do here is we also will need our create user profile document, because we did it before inside of this call right here, but now we're moving it into our Saga. And I know it seems confusing a little bit about why we're pulling all this stuff in, right? But if you follow along, you'll definitely see where we're going with this. Now that we have what we need, we actually need to do our sign-in. So what we'll do is we will wrap our attempt at our API call in a try block. As you remember, any code that we write with an API has a chance to fail. So we need to be sure that we can catch the error. So inside of our try catch, this will handle how we get our errors. The first thing we're going to do is we know what we'll get back is a user ref, right? So let's just make sure that we're getting the right thing first. So we're going to say const user ref equals yield auth.signin with popup, which is the same method that we were running here. And then we're just going to pass in our Google provider. And the reason why we don't want to use this function right here is because we want to actually access the value that gets returned when the success happens with our sign-in with popup. We're going to set it to this user ref, and then we're going to console log out our user ref. Now, the thing that we got to do in order for this to work is we are going to also have to export out our main Saga and then put it inside of our root Saga so that our application listens for it. So we're going to take that same pattern that we did with our root Saga, but make a user Saga as well, because we know we're going to need multiple Sagas. So we can import in all and call, and we will export out a Saga called user Sagas. And this Saga will pretty much just be us instantiating all of our other Sagas that we need to call. So here we're going to do our on Google sign-in start. And then we're going to bring this into our root Saga. And here we're going to do call user Saga. And now we have to also make sure that we are triggering on Google sign-in start whenever our button gets clicked. So there might actually be inside of our sign-in component a couple things we got to bring in. So first, we actually have to bring in our new action that triggers Google sign-in start. From our user actions. And now what we have to do is we will have to connect this in a dispatch. So we'll need our connect as well. We'll need our map dispatch to props. Which will set Google sign-in to start to be a function that simply triggers our Google sign-in to start action. And then we pass this into our connect. So here, nothing is that brand new. We're just modifying our code to now take this in. And then here, we just want to make sure to destructure this off of our props. And now use this instead of our auth.signin with Google. Now, one thing we do have to modify is this custom button on click. I made a mistake before where we didn't say that this type was a button. What ends up happening if you don't do that is that inside of sign-in, if we click sign-in with Google, this form will actually trigger an on submit just because this button is also part of the form element. It's just the nature of what we have to do with buttons. Even if we have a type submit here and this button does not have the type submit, this will unfortunately still trigger a sign-in. So I'll show you. If we click this, we see that we just triggered our sign-in. But this is unfortunate because we don't want to do that. So what we have to do is we have to say type equals button. And by doing type equals button, our button now no longer will actually trigger the submit for our form. So that's just a minor thing that we had to modify that I noticed when going over our project. But now that we have our custom button back in and our Google sign-in start, we do see that what ends up happening is we trigger our Google sign-in start. So now, inside of our Saga, we know that our Google sign-in start needs to be passed in to our take latest. So if we go back, let's clear this. If we click Google sign-in start, we see that we trigger our dropdown. We'll select our sign-in user, and we should see what we get back, which is this object that has these different properties, right, that tell us what type of operation it was. But the user is actually the user auth object that we were using before to build out our profile. This is that same user auth object that we were using and passing in inside of our app right here. This user auth object that we were checking for and passing in is now what we're getting back. So we got to make sure to pull off the user object from our user ref. So we can just destructure like this. And once we have this value, we know that what we need to do is we got to get our snapshot from this value that we now have. So what we can do is we can now make sure to set a const user ref that will know a get back when we call, as we remember using our call method, create user profile document, and then our new user. So as we remember, this is pretty much the same as us running this function, except it's in the format instead of an async await. Right now we're using our yield and our call that we get back from our Redux Saga effects. Now we need our snapshot, which we are going to get by calling yield userref.get. And now we're going to actually issue out our success call, our action. So we got to import in our Google sign in success and our Google sign in failure from our user action. And then we're just going to yield the put of our Google sign in success. And as we remember, we need to get the snapshot ID and then spread in the rest of the data. So we can do user snapshot.id and then spreading in the rest of our user snapshot.data. And then we'll also make sure to yield the put of our error if we get an error. Google sign in failure with the error. And now, hopefully our sign in with Google will work. So we see that we trigger our Google sign in start when we click our button. We select our user. And then our sign in works. We load our actual user in, right? We get our user ref. We get the snapshot. We pass that data. We trigger our success. And then our user reducer updates the current user with our payload that we're passing in as our actual final action. Now, hopefully this makes sense. I know this is a longer lesson, but this refactor is going to be pretty extensive. So it's good that we take some time to make sure we look at every step that we're going to take. Now, if this didn't really make full sense, we're going to do something very similar with email, and we'll walk through all of this again in the next lesson.